Next month will mark 1 year since 18 people lost their lives and 13 more were injured in a mass shooting in Lewiston. Today, Senator Susan Collins introduced a bill that aims to prevent similar tragedies from happening. The Armed Forces Crisis Intervention Notification Act would require the military to use state crisis intervention laws. Collins' reforms would require each military branch to report to local law enforcement and to events. A service member has their military firearms confiscated after making threats to themselves or others, or when a service member has been involuntarily committed to a mental institution. The proposed legislation, of which Senator Angus King is a co-sponsor, comes after a final report was released by the independent commission investigating the Lewiston shooting.
What all three of the investigations found was a failure, a serious, deadly failure to communicate by the Army Reserve more fully to the local sheriff, for example, that might have caused, as the Governor's Commission found, the sheriff's office to be more assertive, more aggressive in its outreach to Robert Card.
Collins says she filed the bill as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act. She expects it to come to the floor for a vote in December.